Hello and welcome. Bonjour et bienvenue. A lot of colleagues at my university have asked me how to make and use pivot tables in Excel. They've heard talk about them, but they've never really used them. They don't really know what they are. So you might say they're pivot table curious. This video is intended to demystify pivot tables while providing a very brief introduction into how to use them. So to begin this demonstration, let's consider a data range of fictitious student enrollment data. It's really easy to make a pivot table. You just click anywhere in your data range, and then you choose Insert, Pivot Table. Excel will identify the contiguous rows and columns around the cell that you selected, allowing you to confirm the range. And let's have it make the pivot table in a new worksheet. So you just click OK. And it takes us to that worksheet. Now we have to choose the fields to analyze. Now this step is completely reversible and flexible, which illustrates the most important lesson about pivot tables. Play with them until you get what you want. You can't break it. Pivot tables are most useful for comparing and cross-referencing multiple fields. So for this example, I'm going to select several fields representing the diversity of the fictitious student body. I like to include one field to count, such as the unique identifier of the fake student ID number. And I also want to consider the academic load, full or part-time, the program language, English or French, the sex of the student, and their citizenship status. Now you see that Excel has arranged most of these fields in rows, and it's counting the sum of the student ID numbers. That's not what we want. First of all, we want to just count the ID numbers. So we're going to change the field setting to say count instead of sum. And now we're going to move some of these rows as columns. We're going to pivot these rows into columns. And that's why this is called a pivot table, because you can interchange so easily between rows and columns. So let's move academic load and program language as a column. And we're going to cross-analyze according to sex and citizenship status. And you can see that the pivot table is generated instantly with the counts of student ID numbers, the counts of students or entries that fall into each subcategory. And we can visualize this analysis even more clearly if we make a chart that represents this table. So by clicking on the pivot table, I can then select Pivot Chart. It's suggesting a clustered column, and that's what I want. Now let me explain what we're looking at. As you can see in the pivot table field pane, Excel is counting the number of student IDs or table entries and reporting the counts in the table depending on whether the student is full or part-time, in French or English stream, and if they're female, male, or undeclared, according to their citizenship status. The table also tallies up all the subtotals you might be interested in, and the graph attempts to show all of this detail with different categories and different colors in the legend. You can adjust the level of detail easily by collapsing or expanding the row or column headers. If you don't need to know the breakdown for female students, just click on the minus beside female, and it'll hide those details. Same can be done for male and undeclared, and you can click on the plus to restore that level of detail. The drop-down menus also let you filter what data you're analyzing if you want to focus your comparison to a certain subset, such as full-time students, for example. Now, the fields in the columns or rows are there to allow you to make comparisons. Now, if the current arrangement is not the best representation of the comparison that you had in mind, you can just drag the fields around until you find the ideal comparison. For example, let's move sex over to the columns and program language down to the rows. And if I drag the citizenship down below program language, it becomes a subset of program language rather than the other way around. And the table and the graph are instantly updated. Now, to go further, maybe not all of these fields represent comparisons that you want to make. If you have a field where you would rather look either at one subset or at another or at the combined total, but not the two side by side, it's probably more appropriate to treat that field as a filter. Perhaps you would never compare the demographics of full-time students with those of part-time students. Well, then you could just drag the academic load field over into the filter box. Now you'll note a new drop-down menu has appeared, allowing us to filter the overall data that we're looking at according to either full-time status or part-time status or both. And the table and graphs are updated instantly. Another way to apply a filter is by creating what's called a slicer. If you go to Pivot Table Analyze, you can insert a slicer and then choose the field on which this filter will be based, like our academic load. You can resize this and position it where you want on the sheet. It just floats over top of the cells like a chart does. Now I can apply the filter visually by simply clicking the buttons. The slicer is always coordinated with the filter, so I don't really need both. And I can remove the academic load from the filter field by simply clicking and dragging it off of the window. The slicer remains, allowing me to filter the table values and the charts with a click of a button. You might also decide to insert a second pivot table below the first one if there's a different analysis that you need to do. To insert a pivot table at this cell, A21, just click the cell, then go to Insert Pivot Table. It will ask you to select the data range. Go back to Data, click A1, Control Shift, right arrow, down arrow to select the entire data range, and we're going to insert it into the existing worksheet at that cell. Maybe you want to know the average GPA according to program language and sex. You can quickly calculate this by selecting program language, cumulative GPA, sex. You can now quickly separate the fields into rows and columns, and you can specify that we don't want to know the sum of the GPAs. That doesn't make sense. We want to know the average values. And you can see that the average GPA has been calculated for all the different subcategories. And we can change that to show a more reasonable number of digits. The most important advice I can give is to play around until you find the comparison that you want and the graph that shows it. And one final comment is that the pivot table remains linked to the original data. So if you paste different values into the original data range, your pivot tables will update accordingly. This makes it very easy to generate update reports if you had to perform the same analyses time after time.